Another 5-minute mystery. The entrance to the Lawrence house on Center Street is lighted by an unshielded bulb. Beneath it stands a policeman. Suddenly, a woman comes running up the porch steps.
What's the matter? Has something happened?
Do you live here, ma'am?
I'm Mrs. Lawrence's personal maid and housekeeper. I've worked for her for years.
Knew her pretty well, then.
Of course. What do you mean, knew her?
I'm sorry to have to tell you this, ma'am, but Mrs. Lawrence was murdered tonight, a couple of hours ago.
Murdered? Let me go in there. Let me go in.
I'm sorry, ma'am. Anything I can do to help, I'll be glad to do.
Yes, there is one thing you can do. Take me to the police station. Murder, is it? Well, I'll tell a thing or two now. And that's how it was, Inspector. I went out for a couple of hours tonight. It was my regular night out. And when I came back, that policeman refused to let me in.
I see. Well, Miss...
Just call me Agnes, please, sir. People have for so long now.
All right, Agnes. Now tell me. How long were you gone tonight?
Not more than a couple of hours, Inspector.
I see. Everything was all right when you left?
Perfectly. Everything was fine, except that I never did like the idea of her seeing him again. I believe she was expecting him tonight, after I'd left.
And just who is him?
Why, her husband, I mean. They were divorced some years ago. He was a friend.
And Mrs. Lawrence was seeing her husband again?
The last few nights, sir. All of a sudden, unexpected-like, Mrs. Lawrence came in one night and told me her husband was coming for dinner. I told her then I didn't like it.
Was there any trouble?
Not a bit, sir. In fact, things went too well. In fact, I believe Mrs. Lawrence was getting a bit soft on him again, and after all these years, too.
Tell me, where does he live?
Over in Cranville. He's lived there for over a year now.
That's about 15 miles away, isn't it?
That's it, sir.
Well, he could have driven that and been back in time for an alibi. Tell me, did anyone else know that Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence had become friendly again?
Not a soul, sir. It was a secret that just the three of us knew. But if you want my opinion, it was him that poisoned her. Must have been him. There was the very devil in that man.
Agnes, up to a point, I believe you're right. But because of just one thing, one mistake in your story, I'm going to hold you for the murder of Mrs. Lawrence.
The inspector has a good reason for holding Agnes for murder. Do you know what it is? We'll tell you in just a minute. But first... And now, back to our 5-minute mystery and the murder of Mrs. Lawrence.
Me? Murder? I wasn't even home when she died.
Agnes, I know it was you who murdered Mrs. Lawrence. When you saw her and her husband becoming friendly again, you believed it would affect your inheritance. How do I know you're the murderer? For just one good reason, Agnes. I specifically gave orders that the method of murder would not be discussed with anyone. You yourself said that Mrs. Lawrence was poisoned. Only one person could have known that. The murderer himself.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This must be a big case we're headed for, Inspector.
Well, you're right in a way, Stokes. I've known old Sherry, the man who's been murdered, for a long time.
Isn't he the guy who owned a lot of diamonds?
Yes, he had several very valuable ones in his collection. And I think somebody killed Sherry for those diamonds.
Any idea who?
We'll find that out after we get inside.
Oh, hello, Inspector Crothers. I'm glad you got here so soon.
Oh, hello, Dr. Matthews. I brought Sergeant Stokes along to help.
Fine. Come on in, won't you? The man who phoned me, Mr. Sayers, is in the study where they found Sherry.
We'll come along after you, Doctor.
Inspector Crothers, this is Mr. Sayers who found Mr. Sherry unconscious when he came in.
How do you do, Mr. Sayers?
Holy Moses, look at this place. Looks as though a cyclone had struck it.
Now, tell us what happened, won't you, Mr. Sayers? I'd like to get the story straight.
Well, in a very confidential capacity, I represent a large diamond buying syndicate. Mr. Sherry was known to have a very extensive collection of gems, one specimen in particular that our firm wanted to buy.
And you were sent to see if he would sell it?
That's right. I made an appointment with Mr. Sherry for this evening. He said to come here and that he might be back here in the study and not hear the bell. If no one answered, I was to come right in. He would leave the door unlocked for me.
Isn't that a rather strange thing for a man to do who has a valuable collection of diamonds in his house?
Well, I thought so at the time, but I thought also that Mr. Sherry was perhaps, well, eccentric. You see, I'd never met him, nor, as a matter of fact, heard of him until yesterday. I come from another part of the country, you see.
And he was alone.
Completely. You can imagine how shocked I was at finding Mr. Sherry lying on the floor by the desk, unconscious, and the room all upset.
When Mr. Sayers phoned me, I imagined that Sherry was suffering from one of his chronic attacks. However, I find that the man has been hit at the base of the skull by a powerful blow, breaking his neck and killing him instantly.
You say you were familiar with Mr. Sherry's chronic attacks, Doctor?
Yes, I've been Mr. Sherry's personal physician for many years.
That was why I phoned Dr. Matthews, Inspector. I knew that he would be able to offer the best help.
Mr. Sayers, your theory is a very nicely calculated one. In fact, I would have acted on it if it hadn't been for one thing. As it is, though, I'm holding you for the murder of Mr. Sherry and for the attempted theft of his diamond collection.
What mistake did Sayers make that caused the inspector to hold him on a definite charge of murder? In just a moment, we'll tell you, but first... And now, back to our 5-minute mystery.
Hold me for murder? Why, Inspector, I told you...
I know, Mr. Sayers, you told me a little too much. When you said you had never met Sherry, nor heard of him until a day ago, everything was fine. But when you said you called his personal physician purposely, you caught yourself. If you knew nothing about Sherry, you couldn't have known who his personal physician was.
Say, Inspector, that's pretty clever. Pretty clever.
Another 5-minute mystery.
That was a grand show, Pete.
At $5.50 a seat, it had to be.
There you go about money again.
And why not? If I had it, we'd be married by now.
We can't wait for my uncle to die to inherit his estate.
I'm sorry, Margaret. No bank account, no marriage.
Pete, if I get some money, will you do as I ask?
Maybe. But how are you going to get your hands on any?
Never mind how. I'll get it.
Hey there, Miss Talbot. You sound grim. What are you going to do?
Get a dowry for my marriage?
Hello? This is Graham.
Mr. Graham, this is Inspector Todd, police.
Police? What's the matter?
I'll have to ask you to come down to my office at headquarters. Your fiancé's uncle has been killed in an automobile wreck.
Good heavens, of course. I'll be right down.
Pete, it's horrible. Uncle Mike dead.
I know. Now, please, Margaret, stop crying.
I'm Inspector Todd, Mr. Graham. Would you have a chair, please?
Oh, thank you.
Now, about the wreck. I've already told you about the car going off the cliff.
I knew something would happen to him with that new English car of his. He's just learning how to drive it.
We have evidence that points to murder, Miss Talbot, not an accident.
Murder?
Yes. Our investigation proves that the steering wheel of the car was tampered with. The wheel broke on a treacherous stretch of road about a mile from your house, Miss Talbot. It was a clever scheme.
A completely fiendish one.
I agree. Miss Talbot, I'd like very much to question Mr. Graham alone. Would you wait outside for a moment, please?
Of course.
I'll put my cards on the table, Mr. Graham. I believe that your fiancée killed her uncle by fixing that wheel.
But she couldn't have done it. She's innocent, I tell you.
Well, why are you so certain?
Because I loosened the wheel.
You?
Yes. I decided to do it last night. We were sitting in the car in the garage, and we were talking about the future. Pretty soon I had my arm around Margaret, and I thought how swell it would be if we could get her uncle's money and marry.
Which arm did you put around her?
Well, the right one, of course. What else when I'm sitting at the wheel? After I took her to the house, I came back and did it. Now, please, let Margaret go home.
I'm afraid I can't do that. Your imaginary confession, despite its nobility, completely absolves you from the crime. Your fiancée tampered with that wheel, not you. And I'm holding her for murder.
What slip did Pete Graham make in his confession to Inspector Todd? In just a moment, we'll know. And now, back to our story.
Your confession fell apart completely, Mr. Graham, when you told me that you had placed your right arm around her while you were at the wheel. Since the uncle's car was of an English make, as Miss Talbot pointed out, the steering wheel is at the right of the car, making the arm position you described impossible. No, Mr. Graham, your motive does you credit, much more so than your storytelling. I wanted you to convince me of a few details. Your confession proved your innocence and her guilt.